All right. Welcome to the Helpful for Life morning show. I'm Reed Garcia,
This is Ryder Richards.
and this is the morning show where we talk about things.
Yes, excuse me, my voice sounds like I drank whiskey and smoked cigars all night.
Is that because you drink whiskey and smoke
I
cigars all night?
wish. I think it's just allergies kicking in. It's so unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's just how you sound, right?
Yeah, I mean, sound like a lounge singer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've had a lot of people come to you and be like, Ryder, not only do I like the way you look, but I like the way you sound.
Actually, no.
No? No one's ever told you that?
No
Oh.
one ever says that. They're mostly like, can you stop sounding? Those sounds coming out of your face.
I don't really care how they sound. Just stop
Just
'em.
stop it.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the morning show where, we are failing forward with you guys every day. We're trying to improve ourselves individually, our shows, hopefully some of you guys, but most importantly, we're here.
Yes, we made it once again. I'm starting to really like the phrase failing forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that is the name for our show. Those of you out there who actually want to comment and help us out on this, maybe we should crowdsource this sucker.
I had the same idea, and I think it could be a quite a fun experiment, right?
Yeah. What was the example that they tried to crowdsource something in Britain? It was like the name of a boat.
It was Bodie McBoatface. Was
Yes,
that the one?
That's the one. Yay! Yay for crowdsourcing and democracy.
All right. Show McShowface.
that's
Here we
it.
go. That's the one. Well, so for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, I'm sorry in advance.
Yeah, because you've missed out on so much wonderfulness.
Yes, that's what I was implying. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice save.
Oh, well.
Well, we are on episode 3 right now, which is technically our 4th episode. We had a little episode 0, which was kind of a half episode as we kicked the tires a little bit, and I think we have improved every day. We'll see, maybe we'll regress today,
Yes, please. Let's get back to a baseline of suckiness and failure.
All right.
Yeah.
I like that. That might be it too. A baseline of suckiness and failure. That really rolls off the
Man,
tongue.
oh, it does, doesn't it? Make an acronym out of that. I'm not even going to try.
Spelling hard. But we've talked a little bit about routines and focusing on doing a little bit every day versus the end goal. We've talked a little bit. We touched on the subjects very briefly about money and society and all of these types of things. But yesterday we had a really deep topic that I want to make sure that we talk about again, which was the concept of letting your dog scratch their butt across your carpet. And so yesterday, I just wanted to point out this might be a little small for you to see, Ryder, but this was a sticker we saw yesterday. We went to Deep Ellum Brewing, and I couldn't make this up. Danielle saw this picture of the dog scooting their butt across the thing, and I was like, man, that is very serendipitous.
That's yes. And in the future, we'll probably have like a animated GIF of this dog sliding into the screen.
Yeah, for those of you who have no idea what we're talking about, just go look around and look for the one where I'm on a couch, kind of like Tom Cruise, except instead of jumping, I'm doing something else.
It's very hip thrusty.
Yes. But yeah, yesterday, one of the things we talked about, I believe, was changing your environment. And if that wasn't yesterday, maybe it was in the last couple days. But especially if you're stuck in a rut,
Yes.
Which we also said could be a groove. Environment is a big part of that a lot of people don't think to change, or they don't think will have as big of an impact as you did. So yesterday, Danielle and I took that to heart and decided to, that combined with the talk about drinking beer during the day, we went to a brewery. Yeah, so it was, this was like 2:00.
Lovely. I mean, that's the perfect time to hit a brewery because you only meet the people who really love beer.
Yes, the hardcore people. It was great. There were all sorts of people there. It was lovely. And for those of you who don't know, Deep Ellum is down in Dallas, and it's one of those classic areas of town where it kind of goes up and down, and sometimes it's really sketchy and there's shootings and homeless and things like that. But it's also a really good art area, which I wasn't planning on talking about this, but since we're talking about it, I'd be curious your thoughts on that as a man of art. And it's interesting because I don't know. I feel like a lot of times art is associated with both like the lowest end of the I was gonna say spectrum, but as far as like societal money, things like that, and also like the highest end of
Yeah.
the spectrum. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, I've got so many. I've got years of thoughts on that. There's really quite there's something very fascinating about it too, because when I start talking to people about what they like as far as art goes. I mean, Reed, whenever somebody asks you like, well, why do you like this or something, like what's your typical response?
You know, that's a great question, right? That's why. And do you mean specifically with art, or do you mean
Yeah,
that
I
broadly?
think let's stay specific with art, because this becomes, I think, a gateway into a lot of other things with art.
For sure. Yeah. So why do I like a piece of art? And we're drawing the boxes here. Where are we
Yeah.
constraining? Are you saying that, could that be music, or could that be a movie, TV, or you want us to just
Let's
say
stick with
painting
visual
or
arts, because that's
visual
my
arts?
background, and then we can sort of see if it expands
Sure.
outwards. But
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's a good question, and honestly, one that I probably have not been asked very many times. Just to give a little background on my exposure to art, I would say, growing up through school, K through 12, went through the standard art in third grade or whatever type of thing. But art is something that I never explored quite as much as I would have liked to, and it's something where I wish I would have, and obviously it's never too late. And I am exploring art now and some of the creative video and some of the photography and things like that I do. But yeah, I just really like the idea of art, and I'd say more intentionally I started to kind of consume it, if you will, starting to go to museums and things like that over the last few years. And so, going to art museums and also history museums, science museum, things like that. So yeah, I would say the question was probably asked of me when I was at one of these art museums, and then it's like, well, why do you like this thing, right? Well, I feel like it makes you think about something, it makes you feel something, or you just think it looks cool.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is kind of a fascinating range to get into, right? Is a lot of people are very reliant on that initial impact, whatever it is. Like, this looks cool, right? This makes me feel something. And so in a lot of ways, art sort of serves as like an emotive force. Which I think is pretty fascinating. And so when we're talking about art in the Deep Ellum area, what you'll find, at least in Dallas and in most cities I've been to, is there's pockets of art, and it's different kinds of art in different parts of the city. So you might have some galleries that kind of overlap here or there, but Deep Ellum also has a lot of murals on the wall, right? Which is like a very public form of art. It very much showcases some cool stuff, so people feel good, and then they go take a selfie by it, right? Because it's like, I love this. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to put myself right in the middle of it and take a lot of pictures of me ruining this great mural.
So you're not implying that you have certain feelings or thoughts about
No,
that at all?
none. No, no
Okay.
emotions on this at all. No, I actually, it is something that is now built into public art. Is that you've seen the thing they had in McKinney that it basically says un que, which is supposed to be unique, but you're supposed to stand in the position of the eye, which I think is really quite funny, because we now develop public art for the person to put themselves into the center of this. And so a lot
How
of
American of an idea,
yeah,
right?
right, right. We can't just enjoy the thing without putting ourselves into it. So there's really something fascinating about how art operates in society, and I get really interested in art, especially in how it plays a public role and then a private role, how it becomes almost instinctual that people like certain things and they can't really explain why or how, and that's just kind of part of it. And so art sort of inhabits this very strange space that we don't let almost anything else get away with. Like, there's almost everything else in our life has to be sort of rationalized or controlled, but art, for some reason, it's fine to just feel something, to just like something because it looks cool. It's okay to spend lots of money on it, which is fascinating. It's like a sign of high culture to feel something and immediately have an impulse buy, and as long as it's art, it's justified.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a couple of things that operate like that in the world: education, home buying, things like that. But most of the time, we don't really consider these actions. So I really do like what a place like Deep Ellum does for the arts, because it's not only broadcasted publicly, but they do have galleries within the region. And then, of course, when we start getting into things like bars, we also end up with live music. They have live music venues down there. And so it sort of expands as this artsy place, which also seems to somehow mean a feeling place.
Yeah. No, and there's a lot in there that I'd like to dive into, and some that I'm sure we won't get to today. But one of the things I want to make sure to put a pin in and talk about later this episode is buying a house, because I think that's a very topical thing right now, and especially with the real estate market here going crazy and things like that. And I've had a couple people in my life who, I say despite the market, are still considering it. And so I want to talk a little bit about that later. Because buying a home is a very interesting thing. Probably the most emotional and psychological purchase that people will make in their lives.
Yes.
So
and
just
long-term
dangling,
ramifications. It goes on and on. And the more we get into economics, we can talk about a whole lot of topics. But home buying is a really big one. And of course, I've got like a personal story on all this, that I've done some stuff in the last year and a half that we can discuss as well.
Yeah, for sure. But back onto the art, and another point that you said that kind of resonated with me was, I self-identify as someone is extremely rational and logical, and, to bring up our favorite punching bag, Danielle, anytime she's doing something wrong, objectively wrong, naturally, not subjective at all. Right?
No, it's never subjective.
I'm looking there and I'm saying, okay, well, X leads to Y, leads to Z. Can't you see that, right? And obviously, it's not always that clear. And the difference between rational, logical, and that emotional side, I think, is a great kind of lens to view art through, because sometimes it is very illogical and very irrational. And a classic example people bring up is like, I could have done that, right? And one quote I heard the other day was that someone came up to Picasso later on in his career, and he was out in public somewhere, and was like, "Hey, can you make something for me?" And he sits there and he spends like five minutes or 30 seconds or whatever, and then they're like, "What? You're already done? Like, how?" And he's like, "Look, lady," and this is how Picasso talks. Let me give him a little bit of
Hey, lady. Yeah.
What is he? Is he like English or French?
French, I
He's
think.
French.
Yeah.
He's lady. Look, I have spent 30 years learning all of these things to do that in that way, that quickly. Now get out of my face.
Yeah, he was also a bit of a chauvinist, so this all makes a lot of sense.
Lady, get out of my face. Yes. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, this is Ryder Richards, which, all around dude, I think was his title.
Super dude?
Super dude.
No, that's too aggressive.
Yeah.
Like, can we tone
Duty.
that down?
I don't know. One of those things. But we, we'll just let you see the overlay. Oh, there's a little coffee shop for you. Nice up close. Cheers. And then here is Ryder Richards, co-host. We kept it simple for him
there
today.
we go.
So
Yeah.
he wears a lot of hats, but one of them is co-host.
Co-host dude.
Yes, co-host and dude. But the reason I'm bringing up Ryder is because he is an artist, or at least I would identify him as one. But that's an interesting topic in and of itself, identifying with the thing you are doing and labels and whatnot. But and are you doing it full time versus on the side?
Yes,
and all that
yeah.
kind of stuff,
And do you make money off of it? Because then you're a professional. But if you don't, you're an amateur or a hobbyist, or and we can sort of break that down. But I think I have at least 2 degrees in art, so I'm at least educated in art. I continue to make. I have exhibits fairly frequently. I used to be quite prolific, having lots and lots of art exhibits. And so I think that there is something within that space of saying, like, even now, if I'm not as heavily involved, then I'm still quite active. Once again, have developed lots of opinions about it.
Naturally.
And yeah, this is the fun thing about art too, is it's one of those phrases that encapsulates so many things. People will consider almost anything art. And that's sort of strange, because once everything is art, then basically nothing is art. Mm-hmm. It loses its value at that point. So I'm kind of fascinated in things like how we can break this down and talk about it. I think it becomes really fascinating whenever economics enters the art world, because then people gauge its value based off of sales. And that gets us back into that sort of economic realm again. But if you're going to do anything that's based off of sales, then a lot of people end up sort of crowdsourcing things. And that's when it becomes really important to know what people like. And whether or not you're making something for what somebody else likes, that's their taste, that's their aesthetic. And oftentimes it's controlled and developed, like you said, in third grade art. That's where the impulse for a lot of these things come from. And it's perpetuated from there.
And I don't know. I would imagine that a lot of people's first exposure to art in their lives, at least in America, is in the form of, here's this macaroni art or this weird sketch that I made, and let's put it on the refrigerator, and that type of thing. And you know, that's an interesting angle to art to talk about as well, is how, you know, effectively, in my mind, and I bet a lot of people would agree, which honestly is probably a sentence I say all the time, but that's neither here nor there. Over time, people are less and less inclined to do art, because anytime you're creating something, that's giving something for people to judge, right? And that's giving things to be compared at and looked at. And speaking of things to compare at and look at, I just wanted to make sure that we pointed out that our punching bag Danielle has stepped into the room, and she wanted to make sure she said hello, and she also said duty in her comment as well. So, you know, just keep that coming around, right? But before we diverge into other aspects of art, because I'm sure we could sit here all day talking about that.
We could talk about art all day. If we have other topics, you should probably stop.
Oh no, I want to talk a little bit more about art, but I want to go back to that environment and that feel aspect, because that's an element that I myself have come to appreciate much more over the last few years, is design. And design is an interesting word, and that maybe means different things to different people. But when I say design, I mean literally everything that you're around, everything you're consuming has been designed. That could be architecture, could be interior design, it could be, you know, even the set here, right? You know, even the overlays, every little thing has been thought through. Even when things have not been thought through, just because it's not intentional design does not mean that it's not design.
No, yeah, that's also something that's yeah. So we speaking of design, and I think we touched on this the other day, is my wife and I stopped in at Buc-ee's, and that is a gas station that has been designed, and it has been designed as something. It's interestingly enough, it's like a highway tourist trap. Right?
Real quick, for those of you who are not from Texas, or, you know, they've expanded to a couple spots in the southeast, but I think it's largely just Texas. Buc-ee's is a gas station / convenience store. Oh my
goodness.
And that's honestly, it's not really giving it justice for what it is. It's more like a gas station meets Walmart meets not quite the Ritz, but like the country Ritz.
You know? It's the kind of Cabela's Ritz, right?
Yeah.
It's the, you know, anyone that drives a truck and loves hunting automatically loves Buc-ee's.
Yeah.
It's like before going to a gas station was just going to a gas station. Now it's like your ideology is by which gas station you go to, right? It's very strange, but the entire thing is tiled like floor to ceiling, and so it's a very kind of glamorous version of a gas station with lots of products inside, and it's hard to get out the door for less than $40. And so if you ever think of a gas station as some place that you're just going to go and drop $3 and get a soda, this is not the one you're going to go to.
Right. And just to give a couple other touch points so help people realize what this is the only gas station that I've seen that has billboards like hundreds of miles away from where they are. Their sign
it's just
is
like,
literally
hold
just
it
their
in
logo.
for 122 miles.
Yeah,
you know, we have great bathrooms.
Yeah, and they've got these things called like beaver nuggets. They have
I've got some stickers that border on inappropriate in my garage because they're just like beavers are their logo. And then there's this there's usually sculptures, a huge bronze sculpture outside that looks kind of like a Tom Otterness sculpture, but it's a huge beaver that people of course pose with and take pictures with.
And now I'm going to do that thing that a lot of people do in the art world, especially when they're new to it. They just nod their head and like, oh yeah, I know who that is. Otterness. Oh, great work. Have you seen his beaver nuggets?
He has big, juicy. Wait, no.
Whoa. So, but we were talking about design, and you brought up Buc-ee's. Was there a certain aspect of Buc-ee's that you wanted to reference?
mean, it is one of those things where when you like something, when you approach something, whenever you get that feeling of comfort or awe or whatever it is, there is a design in there. And some of the best designers design on a subliminal level.
Right.
So that you end up liking things without even knowing you like them. You end up identifying with them without even knowing that you're identifying. And so that's one of the beauties of design, is that it does run through everything. So you were talking about it being intentional, and then there's unintentional design. Sometimes things are almost accidental and they end up working out for some other larger benefit. But when we come back to things like environment, a lot of people end up intentionally sort of, or let's say unintentionally replicating a design that they think that they like without actually really considering it. So that's a fascinating thing about design, is whether or not it is intentional, whether or not we're conscious of it, and how it does affect us. What becomes even more interesting is when we get into productivity. What do you do with design? Because all of a sudden moving something 1 foot to the left or to the right can make you more or less productive. If you walk into Target, there are examples. There's a book called Why We Shop or Why We Buy or something like this, and the author talks about moving a pallet of Cokes 5 feet forward, and they sold out within a half day.
Wow.
And all it took was just moving it, because people have these distances they're willing to travel before they do their first purchase.
Right.
When you walk into a Target, you go something like 20 to 40 feet before you put something in your cart instantly, because that signifies that you are shopping. So by putting the display in the right area, people will instantly gravitate towards that thing and become shoppers of that item.
Yeah, and that brings up and makes me think of one of the points we talked about yesterday, which is the reminder that no matter how unique you think you are, no matter how special you think you are, no matter how much agency, how much free will you think you have, you're still an animal. You're still a caveman, and you would be surprised how much little subtle changes can affect how you're doing things. And there's a book that I read a while back that it's just fascinating, honestly, and it definitely changed the way that I looked at things, and also changed how intentional I was about designing things. And it's called Nudge, Nudge. I don't remember the author off the top of my head, but it was all about how these subtle changes and how things are presented completely change what people do. And one of the classic examples from that book, is about retirement planning. And, it was a big deal whenever our society as a whole shifted from the pension model to, hey, you're on your own, you got to handle your own retirement. And then, shifted a little more to say, okay, you're on your own, but we're going to contribute 4% as long as you match it, right? But what they found was a lot of people weren't doing that. And it was as simple as changing a form and changing what that default is, and do you make somebody check to opt in versus check to opt out? And if you make that subtle shift, all of a sudden, I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but it went from, say, 20% of people opting in to like 75.
Well, right, because they find that to take that extra action, one way or the other, is something people will not do. They won't even take the effort to uncheck a box.
Right.
Most people don't even spend that much time. And the fascinating thing is, so if they opt in for you, right, then this is basically a governmental authority who's saying, we're going to set this up where you're opted in automatically for your own best interests, because you're too human to do it on your own. So we're going to help you out.
Right.
And so they do this for us, and it's kind of a caretaking model in a certain sense, to make sure that we as a society and nation actually get people into retirement. And we can set everything up, but the fascinating thing too is if they opt in, all it would take is an email to opt out, and people don't opt out either.
Right.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it requires work. And it requires choices, right? Which require effort, which, I'm sure is some sort of hardwired human thing. We don't want to do effort.
No, we're not very good at that. Yeah.
I can confirm. I'm definitely one of those people.
Or if we do put in effort, it has to be in going to Deep Ellum Brewery.
There you go.
Yeah. Shout
right.
out.
And just for those of you who are wondering, lovely Danielle has told us that Nudge was by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler. And so if you want to look that book up, it's a great one. And
it's actually mentioned in a book I'm currently reading, which is fascinating as well. The book I'm reading is called The World Beyond Your Head.
Okay.
It's by Matthew Crawford, and he's kind of, he originally got fame for a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft.
Okay.
So
cool.
That fits into my whole DIY aesthetic.
Nice. Yeah. Well, DIY is a topic that we will definitely be talking on in the future, because that's an area that you have a bunch of experience. I definitely got into with the RV thing, and it is very related to design. Excuse me. All those, I don't know, beers yesterday, I guess. They must be doing some work.
Yeah.
But there's two last points I want to talk about on this art and design aspect before we touch on the houses. But one of the things that popped in my mind when we're talking about design, and was actually this show that I've seen recently, It's called Cooking with Cannabis. And we get the chance to talk about drugs. Of course, I'm going to bring up drugs because so far, just for those of you who are keeping track at home, we briefly mentioned abortion so far. Well, we've got drugs.
Yeah, we got that one in there.
There's been humping or butt dragging. Nothing is off topic here, and nothing is out too far out for us to talk about. And that actually, I jest, but that's one of the important things for me with Helpful for Life is we want to make sure that we are talking about the taboo things, because in my opinion, all the things that are taboo we don't talk about, and therefore we're all failing drastically at because of that. And a lot of people don't even realize it because we're not talking about it.
Yeah, there's it's so funny how I think a lot of early society, we worked so hard to liberate ourselves at a certain point in time. Our society was all about liberation, and that's liberation from coercion, from institutions that were treating us poorly or not recognizing certain things in certain people, right? So one of the ways that you get through that is by talking about things. If a certain institution is treating you poorly and no one talks about it, well, then we can never correct for it.
Right. And I mean, now you've seen, fortunately within the last, especially 5 years, more and more people are talking about things, and more people are willing to be a whistleblower, if you will, and then ends up with things like we've had a couple of large movements over the last few years, not bowel movements, but social movements, right?
Well, both.
Yeah. But yeah, we've had Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and others as well.
And previously, we had Occupy and we had some things like that. And since we are sort of talking about design and we're talking about economics a little bit, like we're going to touch on the house thing, there is something really fascinating about the idea that after the 2008 crash, then we can kind of talk about how that is a design problem, that our society has an issue with how money is used.
Yes.
And that's a design issue. And this is once again one of those unintentional designs, or it might be intentional, but we haven't reacted very well to it.
Yeah. And I think, if I have 17 degrees in economics, and I've been studying it for years, so I'm very, very well versed, and I know all of the facts.
Smokes a pipe.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think that was a classic case of capitalism and individualism at its worst, right? On both sides, both the people who were like, all right, we're trying to make as much money as possible, so let's do these junk loans that we know probably aren't the best. And then on the other end, there's like, hey, I can get into this house, even though in my gut I know I can't afford it. I can live in that thing. Like on both sides, you're getting that individual drive for more, yes. and then it ends up falling and crashing. And then of course there's the fun side effect too, where it's hilarious microcosm, fancy way of saying it, and a small example of the larger thing, where because the people in charge, they never got any punishment. Just like in corporations, the default thing is to pass the buck and give off responsibility. Yes. They did it beautifully.
It's in some regards, it's why bureaucracy exists, right? Is to displace blame so that you can't really pin anything down.
Right. You
can't find out who is truly responsible. What's funny about that is, I don't know if you remember there's a military trials, gosh, what is that guy's name? But they basically hung somebody out to dry, and they found a target and they pinned it on them. Yet the military is a massive bureaucracy, so the idea of pinning it on one person is kind of ridiculous. But this is kind of what ends up happening within these kind of frameworks, is we can point at somebody and say that it's their fault. But what was really fascinating about the 2008, those junk loans, is they actually said in their tax statements, we don't know if this is a good idea. It was just on page 1,246 that they actually said that.
Right.
And no one in the IRS has time to read that far to even figure out whether or not what they're doing is legal.
Right. And at that point, it's like, hey, that's one sentence within this massive document. And in reality, how it was presented, right, is not going to get that attention that it maybe deserves. And guess what? It probably wasn't in their best interest to have that be more prevalent, right? Yeah. And that gets into the topic of incentives, which is one that we'll talk about many, many times, because incentives and design and all these things play into why people do things the way they do. And if you're ever wondering, like, why is it that way? Why are people doing it? Well, look at their incentives, right? How are they getting paid? How are they benefiting from it? And for those of you who haven't heard this before, I'll make sure to say, whenever you're consuming some sort of media or news or anything like that, always look at who's publishing it, both the company and or the writer themselves, and think about it like, what do they get out of this, financially or otherwise, and use that to help temper how you're viewing that thing. And I don't want to dive into that too much because we got to come back to the cannabis, right? Because
yes, cannabis cooking
yes,
in houses,
exactly.
right? So we can get into the housing crash, but let's talk about cooking.
Yeah, so let me tell you about this cooking with cannabis, right? So the reason that I brought it up was because it had this element of design that was interesting to me, because when you're cooking a meal, let's say you're at a restaurant, right? And you're a chef. You're thinking through that experience, right? And for those of you who haven't thought about this before, that experience starts before people even get to that restaurant, right? And it ends way after, right? And so one of the things I really like to do is look at the entire user experience. An acronym used is UX for short. That's something that I've also been more and more fascinated with over the last few years, and paying attention and thinking through what is that person going to be and how are they going to experience that the whole way through. How do they hear about the restaurant? How do they find about it? What does their website look like? Then they get there, and then there's the host, and then there's the feel, the design of the restaurant. How dim is it? How bright is it? What's on the walls? And those are all those small little elements. If a restaurant, if you look at the top restaurant, each one of those things has been thought through very intentionally, and that's what leads to a good restaurant, a good experience a lot of the times, right? And if you go to a bad restaurant, you may not be able to put your finger on it, but if you take a second, you step back and you analyze, classic phrase that I like to use, and look at it like, well, why didn't I like this thing? And you realize like, oh, well, this isn't a strip mall. It's concrete on the floor, and all they have on the walls are some, flat pictures, and it's really echoey in here, and, they weren't very personable. And it's like, oh, you start looking at all the elements, whether it be design, and in this case, hospitality. Every one of those elements matters. And I know you have a lot to respond, but I want to get back to the cannabis and that as the chef or the owner of the restaurant is designing these things, well, one of the things is they have a menu they provide, and people get to choose. So they really don't have as much control over that aspect. They do get to offer what people are eating. But the cool thing about this show is it's a mix of that traditional cooking show where it's like, here's this thing, here's this challenge, go cook this thing. And they give some sort of like, all right, you need to use chocolate, or you need to cook in this type of style, or whatever. They have some sort of restriction or constriction that people do. And then they feed the meal to people. And they do a lot of things really great on the show. One, they have a couple people who are more of the host and the more critical of the actual food and stuff. And then they have a table of, 4 to 6 people who are not quite lay persons, but they're more like the average person. And a lot of times they sprinkle in maybe a comedian or an actor or something like that. And they're the ones who are there just eating, having a good time, and talking about it. But the element of design that's really cool with this is the chefs get to choose how much and with what part of marijuana they use in each part of the dish. And they have an appetizer, they have an entree, they have a dessert. And so you hear things like, hey, I'm going to start them off with a little bit of CBD to help lower their anxiety, get people ready to start interacting at the table and things like that. And then after that, I'm going to bring in a little bit of THC. I'm going to hit them hard with the THC. So then like that, they're starting to feel that throughout the thing. And then at the end with the dessert, I'll just finish with just a little bit to kind of keep it going as they're going on throughout their day. And, I'm making up exactly what the things are, but it's cool because it adds this like fourth dimension to the cooking. Right. And also for those of you who are like, oh my gosh, I'll never do the weed and the drugs and things like that, I'd encourage you to watch this show because it's entertaining and it gives you a little bit more of the idea of what all it can do. And then they talk about, some of the benefits, and of course the classic ones are, cancer treatments and things like that, but they talk about a lot of the benefits of marijuana, CBD and THC. And it's a cool way to learn about it in a way that's not like in your face. And it's also not like the other end where it's like, oh, we're all stoners sitting on a couch, right? Sure, there's a little bit of giggling and things like that, right? When the THC dosage is good. But yeah, there's a lot of other positive things in there too.
Yeah, this is something else that is probably worth looking at in its totality is the movement to legalize marijuana. And in the states and areas where it has been legalized, there is a lot of restriction, but there's also been a movement to where you're no longer really trying to buy weed at a vape shop, right? You're not going to a strip center to get this. The dispensaries now look like an Apple store.
Yeah.
They are highly designed. The staff is very intelligent and very passionate about the subject, and they can tailor your experience. And so there's something about this like high-end design, the language that's used, the sort of formatting that's presented, and the idea that it's also in something like this cooking show. We're already accustomed to cooking shows with these constraints. And along the way, not only do they normalize it, but they also educate you about it. And so all of this is designed. And it
Yes.
makes it very easy for us to consume. And then we're processing it without even knowing how readily we're accepting this.
And that's one of the trends that I've really enjoyed watching in media, largely, especially in TV shows and movies. And, maybe it's existed for a long time, but I feel like people are more intentional about it in this day and age. And people have always used media to kind of teach people or show people things or kind of subliminally like slip things in. And I've noticed that more and more in shows lately that people are doing that type of thing, both in this like real life or reality show, but also in the scripted, like, hey, here's this family doing this thing, or hey, here's this gay couple. It's like, but we're not going to talk about the fact that they're even gay, but they're in the show and they're thinking this thing. Oh, wait, they're just like people too, so normalizing that type of thing. And again, all of those things we could keep diving into.
But no, I do like the idea though of the cooking show and the idea of this sort of fourth element, right? Because that can kind of exist as far as sugar consumption and things like that whenever you're feeding somebody, or alcohol consumption, right? So those things might have existed, but this is just a different dimension to sort of add cannabis into that experience, and also thinking about the timing. Like,
yeah, I was fascinated by it.
Yeah, very fascinating.
I mean, because you have that fixed menu, which is, if you go to high-end restaurants, you can get the prefix as the fancy name for it, but the chef's choice and things like that, which I encourage you guys to do, and because they are designing your whole experience. And then the fact that you're adding this extra dimension of the drug, because yes, there's alcohol at bars and restaurants, stuff like that, but people aren't just controlling your dosage, right?
Right.
And so I just really was fascinated by the fact that it's like, hey, we're letting you design this whole experience. So I really like that aspect. But one other thing that we wanted to talk about today, we said we want to talk about the housing, and what was the other thing we wanted to talk about?
Oh, I can't remember.
Well,
now.
I'm sure it'll either come back to us or it won't, and we'll probably talk about it more.
I'm still processing what that military guy's name was.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like it'll show up as soon as the show ends.
Perfect.
I will have it for you.
Perfect. Well, let's talk a little bit about buying a house. What does that mean to you?
Oh, so little background. I'm in my third house that we have, quote, bought, which basically means the bank loaned us money. So I didn't actually buy anything except for maybe like indentured servitude until the loan was paid out. Yeah. But the first house I ever bought was $40,000.
Okay.
And then
This was like 1935 or
45.
Okay.
Come on.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this was back in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And I flipped it, so I put about 20,000 into it and then did all the labor myself. So
you're putting in house improvements and things like that.
Well, yeah, stripped it all the way back down to the studs in some areas.
Stripping to stud.
Oh yeah. Redid the electrical, redid the plumbing, redid the kitchen, the flooring, everything. Moved the washer and dryer. So did a lot of big changes. And if you've done any plumbing, you know what a nightmare it is to move something major like the washer and dryer. And so you're doing that, and you also, of course, have to then at that point move the electrical. So redesign the entire house. Ended up selling it for about $100,000. So that was my first experience with trying to flip a house.
Yeah. So for those who are trying to do the math in their head, you netted what? 30K, something like that?
Yeah, until you factor in closing costs,
sure.
Right? Because you factor in, say, almost 10 grand on closing costs on each end. At the time, it was maybe closer to 8 or something for closing costs on each end. So probably ended up making about $15,000 or $16,000. And that was after all of this work went into it. And basically, I worked on the house for a solid 6 months while keeping a part-time job and running an art gallery.
Yeah. So
yeah.
You know what that sounds like? That sounds like work and effort. Those things that I said that I at least don't want to be doing.
Right.
But, I bet some of the reasons you did that, and I'm going to, correct me, right? But some of that was, one, I don't know if that was intentional from the beginning, like, hey, I'm just going to flip this house, or if it was a financial opportunity, or were some of it about, hey, I want to create this space that I would enjoy to live in, even if you are only going to live in it for a short amount of time. I guess talk a little bit about why you did that.
I think part one was it felt like an opportunity. It felt like a way to make money. I knew I had some of the skills that were necessary, not all of them. And we ended up living in it a while, but the entire thing was it was always designed to be flipped. Like that was the intention from day one. So, but the unfortunate thing is we did end up living in it a while, because at that point we're in a basically $100,000 house, but at that time we were newly married and didn't have enough money to live in another $100,000 house. We couldn't afford the house that I just flipped. So we kind of got ourselves stuck in this pickle where we're between two spots there. And then at some point, my wife ended up purchasing another house. So it was like catty corner. And so we rented that out for a little while, and then we ended up actually moving into that house when the tenant left.
Okay.
And then doing work on that house as well and selling that for a small profit. So it was, at the time, it was sort of a game you could play, but when I'm talking $40,000 to $100,000 houses, I don't know where you do that now.
Middle of nowhere, Kansas, I guess.
Yeah. And then how are you going to sell it for that profit when you're in the middle of nowhere?
Right.
Because no one's going to show up with that extra cash to buy it. So you can build a very, very fancy house, but if no one wants the location,
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought up the flipping aspect and the monetary, the investment and potential return on investment aspect of buying a home, because that is, for some people, one of the main reasons that they do it. And that's kind of been the sage wisdom, especially of generations of yore, where it's like, hey, a house is one of the best investments you can make. It's quote unquote safe. Real estate in general trends upwards, and oh, by the way, it allows you to do something called leverage, which is where you put in a little bit of money, and then you have this larger sum of money that you get to work with because of that, because the bank loans you. So let's just use, for some simple example, let's say it's a $100,000 house. Well, you're going to put down probably somewhere between $3,000 and $20,000. So you put down that, let's just say $10,000, and then you sell it later. Well, you only put down that 10 grand and you pay that mortgage a little bit. But let's say you sell it 5 years later and you've paid, I don't know, $20,000 worth of money. And then you sell that house for, let's just say $150,000, right? Yeah. You've now made that $50,000, even though you've only put in $20,000. So you've essentially doubled your money, right? Mm-hmm. So that's that leverage aspect. And that's one of the reasons why real estate is touted as one of the great ways to save your money, and also, by the way, build generational wealth. That's one of the main ways that generational wealth has been built in this country.
Yeah. Yes, real estate's, it's huge, and it was the advice everyone was giving us when we were young, and I can't say that it has treated us poorly. I'm not interested in moving all the time. I have a sister who I think they move every other year, if not every year.
For this purpose?
Yeah, they just keep trading up and sideways in houses. And, they're at a spot where they're paying cash for houses now. And that's a very interesting thing. It's also, I think there's some pain points in there that I'm not interested in.
Right.
And so I kind of wonder about that. Like, yes, there is money in this, but your quality of life is fluctuating constantly.
Right. And I'm sure you can especially relate, because you know how much work and how much time and effort goes in towards maintaining the property aspect. And I don't know if they're doing rental aspects as well.
Yeah, they have enough properties now to do some rental. And that's kind of, that's something else to get. I don't know. We could jump into that as well, but there is a sort of game, and there's a format, and there's a template for how you do this in real estate. Mm-hmm. That has been figured out. So what's fascinating about that too is that you might want to actually consider that field saturated.
And what do you mean by that?
I just mean that because there is a formula and it's so highly touted, there's so many people in the game looking for the angles, that there are niches you can still find. But I think that when you have that many people competing over these resources, because they know it might be one of the only ways they can realistically grow their money at a 5 or 10% value over time.
Yeah, and the reason that this topic was on my mind is because I was just talking with a friend earlier this week about that, because they were looking to get into it as an investment vehicle, and do the type of thing. For those of you who aren't aware, there are types of loans you can get, especially if it's your first home, where you can put down as little as 3 or 5%, and that allows you to secure that large amount of leverage to make your money work for you. And then you have to live in that home for 6 months or a year, have it be your primary residence. But then after that, you can either sell it, or a very popular way to do it is you then rent that out, make sure people are paying rent enough to cover the mortgage, and then now you have that asset that's accumulating and doing stuff on its own, and then you can go and buy another one, rinse and repeat over and over. But I'm glad you brought up that saturation part, because that's one of the things I was telling him as well, is like, yeah, I mean, it used to be the great way and the easiest way. And also it's kind of easy for us as lay people, as regular people, to wrap our arms around, right? Because we know we have houses, we have friends with houses. You can see like, you definitely got to learn a little bit once you get into how the mortgage work, how the closing costs and the insurance, all that pays together. But it's easy to wrap your arms around, or at least feel like you have your arms wrapped around it. But where the trouble comes is all of those hidden costs that most people, I'm not saying most people, but a lot of people don't think about, right? Like, oh, well, one, there's just upkeep and preventative maintenance and things like that. But then there's the big things, right? Like here in the Dallas area, hail is a big thing that you got to deal with. And even if you have insurance and stuff like that, you still got to spend time and a deductible and effort to get those things replaced. And then you have things like air conditioner, which for those of you who aren't familiar with Texas is very important.
Yes. I think you quite literally need one here.
Yeah.
I think without one, it is dangerous.
Oh, I don't doubt it at all. But yeah, and then so there's all those hidden costs, and those are both monetary and time, which at time is one of those things where, again, I think as humans, a lot of us don't value our time as with that dollar amount as much as you would think, because it's like, hey, you made that 15 grand on that house, but what if you had worked an hourly job that same amount of time? You maybe would have made more money.
No, I mean, that was one of the things that I laughed about, was I basically broke my body every day for several months.
But fortunately, that's why he looks like this, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
All broken.
The last thing I want to say on the house, and then I thought of the next topic, but not because of that face, but because of that body. And that is the fact that if you look at the chart, I'm going to make a lovely three-dimensional chart here for you guys. This is what housing costs have done. As time has gone on, they've skyrocketed way up. Thank you.
Wait,
Thank you.
That's
wait.
the wrong
Oh,
post.
dang. Wait, Germany, I guess.
Yes.
So as time has gone on, the housing process have gone way up. And honestly, recently, it probably looks a little more like this. It kind of curves and it goes way up. But then if you look at, and by the way, that's both for buying a house and also for renting. Like that cost has gone way up. Well, if you look at the curve for people's income over time, that looks more like this flat one. So, it's a lovely dimensional graph here. But the point is, there's that gap is widening and widening for how expensive it is to live the places they are, and the cost that it makes.
And this is, this idea of the flattening income, right, is that there's the majority of the population has not seen a relative wealth increase in 40 years. So that's just basically buying power. Our buying power has not increased in 40 years. Yet the cost of housing and education and some of these other things has gone up exponentially. So it's becoming more and more difficult to live somewhere. And hence you'll see these memes on things like Instagram. I saw one last night where it's like, my parents at age 30 and they're looking at buying a house. Me at age 30 can't even afford this, like, an iPhone cable.
Right.
Because it's $17.
And I'm living in my parents' house.
Yes. And, this kind of angst that shows up and this is where you get the kind of okay boomer phrase, is that these parents are just, well, when I was your age.
Right. And the whole, hey, why don't you have the house with the picket fence and all that kind of stuff, like I did. And that was the goal. So there is some of that societal and generational pressure as well. And also, it's something that we've idealized. It's like, oh, it would be so nice to have that area that's yours. You can do those design elements. And so there is that really touchy-feely aspect of it that people want as well. So that's just a little bit scratching on the surface about what it means to buy a house and whether or not it's worth it. The last point I wanted to make, and then we'll move on, was more and more people are aware of that model. More and more people know that concept, like you were talking about. And then on top of that, there's things like HGTV, which we talked about the other day, like which makes everything feel more attainable and easier than it really is, which is a classic case of media skewing our perspective of things, which leads to people, oh, I could flip a house. I saw them do it, or I watched people on YouTube do it. And oh, by the way, you're just seeing the highlights, and oh, you don't know all the stuff going on behind the scenes, the magic that's happening. And then also there's the other factor of where there's money to be made, people and companies are going to come. So I've heard that there's a lot of businesses now that have started to get more into buying houses. And some of those, by the way, are also foreign companies. Like people from China are coming in, and they're buying up houses because they're either going to flip them themselves or they're going to buy them and rent them. And guess what? All that's doing is driving up that cost for everybody else. Why those people make more money. Classic copy.
Right. And then I think that, quickly before we finish up entirely on the housing thing, I'm curious, you and Danielle are renting right now. And I know you probably did some calculus on that. And this is one of the things that is sort of fascinating is when you look at long-term, short-term, all those kind of things. How did y'all make the decision not to just spend this money on a mortgage and instead spend the money on a rental?
Right. And so one point about buying a house that I want to mention that goes into that logic flow, which is, when you're renting, that money's quote unquote going down the drain, right? That's not doing anything. Whereas if you have a house, you're paying a mortgage, the vast majority of that money, you're essentially putting into your own bank account and to the value of that house. And the only money that's really going out of your pocket per se is your taxes, your insurance, and the interest on that loan. And so that's a common argument is like, well, I should buy a house because of, I don't want to throw my money down the drain, right? Mm-hmm. But that calculus, that deciding that factor from a financial perspective is a big consideration, right? It's like, hey, okay, if I were to buy a house, and then that also, okay, if I were to buy a house, and then you add the caveat that I could afford, that gives me the life and the type of house that I want, right? Those are the type of things where it's like, and then when you start looking at it and you start doing the math, and also you keeping in mind, like, all right, if I'm going to buy a house, like realistically, if you want to make money on it and not go underwater, like on average, you probably got to stay in that house 5 to 7 years. And depending on the market, that could be much longer. And then this is this type of market right now where the prices are way high. It's like, realistically, are the prices going to go up that much in 5 to 7 years? There's also a chance they might just dump, right?
Yeah, I can't see this market staying where it's at right now. So these people are buying houses for $500,000 that are about a $280,000 house.
And that's the thing about leverage is it can work for you, but it can also work against you, right? And that's how you end up with these people who, I bought this house, $500,000, it's great, but then maybe they realize, it's not something that I can afford, or I didn't realize all the cost, or maybe even I just want to move, or I need to move, or whatever.
Well, a lot of people sold their house, right?
Yeah.
They thought it was let's say we'll stick with the same example. They thought they had a $280,000 house. They sold it for somewhere like $500,000. And then they're like, well, now I need another house. Well, they start looking around, and all the other houses that were just like the one they got out of are now $500,000.
Right.
So you're sort of in this spot where now you're taking out another larger loan from the bank. So rather than accruing that value, I don't know. There is kind of a game of moving this around. And if you can do it in the right way and at the right timing, there will be winners on this.
Which is what you're going to hear most about.
Yes,
right?
You're probably not going to hear a whole lot about the people that lost out.
Yeah.
But that's bound to happen. Some people might be upside down on their loan in a year.
Yeah. So again, we could talk about that much more in depth. And I also do want to point out one of the things that I have been working on behind the scenes, but it's something that I'm want to hear from you guys, from the audience. I want to hear a little bit of interest on before I start to put a little more effort into it. And that is this calculator that helps you do that math between renting and buying. And if you go to our website, helpfulforlife.com, and you click on resources, or you go to helpfulforlife.com/resources, you can scroll down and you'll see something along the lines of home calculator, rent versus buy calculator, something like that. And then when you go in there, say that you're interested and put in your email, and we'll notify you, hey, this calculator is going to be is out there now. You can go use it. And we're doing our best to include all of those factors that you don't think about. And again, recognize the fact that it's not just about that financial decision. It's also about how having a home restricts what you're able to do. And that was that, and combined with the if my door messes up, I can call a guy and have him come fix it. Like those two factors were very, very big for me and Danielle, because if I want to move, I mean, we just lived in an RV, right? It's just like, do I want to nail ourselves down to a certain area or a certain home for that? So that was another factor. So let's move on to the next subject, which we only have a couple minutes here. So we are only going to get to the tip of the iceberg of that one. But we were talking about Ryder, and real quick, give us that face one more time. You know that. Oh yeah, that. So yes.
Which one are we going for? I've got like 3 faces.
I got 3 faces. Well, we were talking about that lovely body that you got from doing all of that hard work, that manual labor over the years, and it made me think of. I was like, oh yes, ladies, men, whoever is interested, here's Ryder. But then he's like, wait, but he's married.
Yes.
But wait, what about? Is it okay for people to have sexual relations outside of that monogamous relationship?
we're just going to touch the tip of the
yes,
iceberg.
Yep, just that. Yep.
Oh, that's just an agreement between 2 people. They could decide whatever they want, and if that agreement grows to 3 or 5 people, awesome. I don't have almost anyone I know that actually works for, but sure, have at it. Why not?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing. And I would say, honestly, one of the things that people point to, right, is like, oh, it can't work. Surely it can't work. And in my mind, it gets a lot to the fact that not even from the sexual aspect, but even just is it okay for men and women to be friends? And I think the trend is that's becoming more and more acceptable as time goes on. And I would encourage all of you out there, find friends of the opposite gender. I think it's very, very important. And you wonder why things like toxic masculinity come around, and why, men aren't okay expressing their feelings, and they're not being able to satisfy, I mean, this isn't the sexual side, but to satisfy the needs of a woman in that relationship, kind of like we were talking about yesterday, and vice versa, the women not necessarily knowing what the men need. Well, what better way to educate yourself and to get a little bit more information than to be talking to the person of the other sex, right?
Yeah, there is something really fascinating about that, when all conversations tend to somehow turn into something that's potentially sexual, right? That's sort of a fascinating idea that's, I think, kind of oddly unhealthy, that our society has to, like, if you go talk to somebody of the opposite sex, well, then sex is bound to happen. Like, that kind of premise, it just feels so puritanical. It feels very old. Like, that's so old school. And yeah, I think you need a diversity of friends, right? Just people in all groups and sectors and walks of life. And I think, once again, diversity is hard to do, but I think you have to be intentional about it. I think you have to go out of your way to make sure that you're finding diversity, because it's not going to just come show up knocking on your door when you're in the suburbs.
Right. Yeah, especially depending on where you are, right? And that effort, you have to make more of an effort depending on where you live, right? If you live somewhere super metropolitan diverse like New York City or Los Angeles or whatever, then it may come a little more naturally to you. Oh, these people are just my coworkers or whatever. But if you live a place that's, more like you, whether that means it's a whole bunch of white people or a whole bunch of black people, a whole bunch of lower caste, upper class, all the different ways you could cut it, you got to put more effort in.
Yeah, and we do tend to stratify ourselves by class because of what we can afford. So talking about housing and living, like, what you can afford puts you around people in a similar socioeconomic class. We don't talk as much about class now, but in the last couple of years it's come up more. But there used to be entire movements, political movements, that were based around nothing but class.
Yeah.
And these are kind of fascinating ideas to kind of think about, is that we have now divided those up, and we claim a lot more about individuality rather than class.
Yeah. Well, back to the open marriage aspect. And, I think it is a topic, honestly, that we could talk a whole hour about. But I think with that, as same as the lack of what a male-female relationship can look like, I think that's largely, more likely to fail and things like that. And, every time a guy and a woman get together, they have sex. I think that's more because we have these societal constraints, because men and women aren't ever friends. Well, yeah, the one time that they are, then that's like natural, because that's just what I know how to do as a guy when I'm with it.
Yeah, I don't know how to do anything else. Like, this is my only way of relating to this other person, right? And is in a sexual, like, if it becomes intimate, it has to also become sexual, and those two can actually be separated from each other.
Right. And they are often in marriage.
Nice.
And that's why open marriage can be one of those things, right? And we'll talk about it more another day, I'm sure, since we were just talking about the top of the iceberg, I think is the phrase. But yeah, the point was, and we referenced it yesterday as well, is not to expect everything from your partner and not to have them satisfy all of your needs. And in this case, it's like, hey, if they can go do this other sexual thing and do it in a way that, you know, is safe and everyone is understanding and all that kind of stuff, and they have all the bounds around it, is that something that could work? And so I would be curious to see how that plays out as it becomes more acceptable, if you will, and as you see more and more people try it. Sure, there's going to be plenty of people who fail at it, right? Just like anything else. Yeah. But I think it's worth looking at. So as we wrap up here, I do want to end with our daily challenge for the day. So, you know, Ryder, I'm
try some polyamory.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, I'm curious what pops to your head when we think
at the end of that conversation. That's a daily challenge.
Yes. Oh, no, that is not the daily challenge for today, unless you want it to be, you know. But no, the for those of you who may have a more strict view on drugs, I would say go watch that show. Go watch one episode of that Cooking with Cannabis and try and go into it with an open mind. And remember that, like, we have all of these things that we think and feel around drugs. Guess what? That's because of how the society has made us, because in school, the things we were taught, what the government has pushed, you know, and all of that type of thing. So just regardless of why you think the thing you think, just be open and go watch that show and be like, hey, is this something that maybe could help people or maybe could benefit people in some way? And try and watch it in that open mind and see what you think.
Yeah. I'm down for that.
Yeah. Drugs? Open marriage?
All of it.
All of it.
Yeah, you know, it is kind of fascinating too, because we have foundational things, but I do agree with, like, pushing yourself, finding some boundary that you're not comfortable with, and at least exploring that area, mentally, if not physically.
Right.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are like, Reed, I'm sitting here baked as hell, and it's 8 o'clock a.m. Like, I don't need any convincing. Well, what I would encourage you to do is think of someone in your life who maybe has that kind of more restricted view, and share the show with them and be like, hey, check out this show, see what you think, and let's talk about it. Because again, talk about those taboo topics. You know, I'm sure some people, when they hear, oh, cannabis, and they hear open marriage, they just kind of, they tighten up and they're like, oh, I'm uncomfortable, right? Yeah. Well, guess what? The more you talk about these things, the less uncomfortable it becomes. And guess what? I think we'll all progress as a society the more we're willing to consider things like that.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been The Morning Show, Episode 3, brought to you by Helpful for Life. I'm Reed Garcia.
Ryder Richards.
And have a great day.